everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am talking about 5 ways to improve your writing. Talking about this topic is always kind of nebulous and abstract, and a few of these are a little bit nebulous and abstract because it's such a big, loaded question. How do you improve your writing? Well, we're all kind of at a different level, and what does it mean to improve your writing? In some cases, if you're really kind of newer in 101, it's literally just learning grammar and usage, but I'm gonna be focusing more broadly in terms that can help any writer at almost any writing level. I've done several of these myself because I am definitely still in a state where I need to improve my writing. I don't think I'm ever going to stop improving my writing. So these are things that have concretely worked for me. And of course, many of these are things to pay attention to at the drafting level to essentially teach yourself to do at the drafting level. But plenty of these are also things you can apply in edits. And very often it's applying these things in edits first that essentially rewires our writing brain to do it right or better the next time we draft. So the first thing is one of those more esoteric ones, and that is you need to learn your weaknesses. You need to essentially know what you're not so good at so you know where to focus, because I need to be better at writing is such a broad topic. Once you know your specific weaknesses, you can hyper-target. This includes seeking out resources for those specific things and doing some of the other things I'm going to talk about to target those weak areas. Usually you figure out what you're not so good at by playing the comparison game. It's reading other people's writing and going, oh wow, I realize seeing how good they are at doing this thing that I am not so good at doing this thing. Or you can determine your weaknesses very often, most often through feedback. This is going to be reader feedback, either betas, critique partners, even your agent, editor, or through reviews if you are reading reviews. While reviews are not there to teach a writer, you can sometimes pick up things from reviews. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So basically the first step is to admit you have a problem, because you can't solve a problem until you admit you have a problem. So I want to list off some common writing weaknesses that might help you kind of pinpoint maybe saying these things and you looking them up, or in many cases I have videos on these on my channel, will kind of set off a light bulb moment for you or connect you to something that you've gotten from reader feedback. And some of those things are white room syndrome. This is where anything could take place in a white room because you're essentially never describing what's going on in scenes. Passive voice is a really, really big one. Purple prose, this is where, yeah, your words are pretty, but do they mean anything? Melodrama, really, really big one. I find that's a big kind of novice writing mistake. If you've watched my fanfic video, you know how I feel about melodrama, says someone who's prone to melodramatic writing. Inconsistent characters, this is a really big one. If you're getting feedback that people don't believe things that your characters are doing, or even just that they're not emotionally attaching to them, you have character problems. Insta-love, this is a very kind of specific, it's almost like a trope thing and a lot of people hate it, but this is a weakness in writing that you can definitely fix that ties into character. Telling too much. You hear telling versus showing all the time. And another one of my tips here is going to kind of feed into that. But I think it's almost too basic to say show, don't tell. I think that's very kind of limiting writing advice, despite it's not in this video specifically, but you might have a problem with telling too much. Stilted prose. This is just like, essentially your sentences, they're awkward, they're boring, you're not being vivid enough, and essentially stilted prose usually just leads to an unpleasant reading experience. You'll have readers stopping and just not getting through your work. Inauthentic dialogue. Some people are really great at dialogue, others aren't, and there are definitely steps you can take to improve it, and very good dialogue and dialogue scenes can make a huge difference in a novel. Pacing, big one. Even prose can have trouble with pacing, and of course the answer here is to learn a lot about structure. And not enough conflict or high stakes. Essentially you get into a problem where people just don't care about what's going on in your story. Very often this is both a character and a conflict stakes issue, and very often those conflict and stakes feed into pacing. I have videos on a ton of these topics, and I will link to all of the relevant ones down below, and this is just a starter list for you. There are all sorts of other things, crafty things that you can struggle with in your writing, and so the first tip is to identify what you are not great at. Accept it about yourself, accept that everyone has weaknesses in their writing. And what's great is once you have a pretty good idea of your weaknesses, you can pinpoint them one at a time to improve your craft. So the second tip for improving your writing is to analyze and then emulate your favorite writers, or even just not your favorite writers. This is just writers who are doing better than you are at the things that you want to improve at. I actually put this one into action. I was reading a book by a friend and I was just really engaged with the dialogue scenes in particular, the scenes with like lots of different characters, and I was just really impressed. I was never confused about who was speaking, and I could just visualize everything that was happening, and that's something that is a weakness of mine. This ties into white room syndrome, and I just basically stopped myself as I was reading, to think a compliment at this writer, and then I decided to analyze, well, what were they doing that was making this work so well for me? So I looked at a line-by-line level of exactly what they were doing with their dialogue and kind of dialogue tags and action tags, and that what I found was this writer barely used dialogue tags at all. Very few instances of they said, she said, he said, etc., or whispered or whatever. It was almost exclusively action tags, meaning having vivid and specific action between all of the things that people were saying. And so I then actively, in my next draft, pulled way back on dialogue tags, which I tended to use, especially in scenes where a bunch of different people were talking. And I emulated what this writer was doing, using far more action tags to make it clear who was speaking, but also to really freshen up my scenes and show what was happening in them. And also specifically what this writer did that I was like, oh, I should emulate that, is if you're smart about the actions that you use in a scene like that, the very actions of the character reveal personality traits about that character. You're also actively doing characterization. So that is a great example. I was reading something, I was impressed by what someone was doing, I decided I wanted to do that thing, and I pinpointed how they were doing it, and then implemented it in my own writing. So that's what you should be doing. If you have a critique partner who is just really, really good at something, ask them how they do it. Hopefully they can explain. Not all of us writers can like pinpoint exactly how to do something. It's because writing is weird and creative and nebulous, but maybe you can get some concrete advice, or just read books by your favorite authors. Knowing what your weaknesses are, narrow in on those strengths from those writers. They're strong at things that you were weak at, and try to zero in on how they're doing what they're doing. I'll admit this is kind of a 201 or 301 writing skill. If you're just starting out in writing, kind of looking to how other people write isn't always going to be helpful, because the dangerous line here is imitation. While imitating another writer can definitely teach you a lot about writing and help you improve your writing, you can also get into the dangerous territory of just becoming a really great imitationist, and copying other people's writing isn't the best way to go. It's more about absorbing little tidbits of other people's strengths and techniques and process to improve your own process. So be very careful with this one. The third tip for improving your writing is a new favorite of mine, and that is dramatize where you are narrating. This is another one where I have a whole video on it, and I will link to that down below if you want to watch me talk for like 12 minutes about this, but in brief. So this is the cousin of telling versus showing. Narrating is to say something briefly that has happened. You're basically glossing over an action that has happened and telling the reader that it happened. This is a very effective technique. I mean, you can't do an entire story that is all dramatization. Dramatization being when you dramatize, when you show through interactions of characters, something happening, actively happening on the page. You do need a balance of both narration and dramatization, narration and dramatization. But where this becomes a tip for improving your writing is I have found a lot of writers rely far too heavily on narration, so they have a ratio that is off in their story. And a book that relies too heavily on narration is going to provide a very passive reading experience. There's going to be distance in the story for the reader. It's like they're being told a story versus experiencing it themselves. And so focusing on switching instances of narration to dramatization wherever possible is going to improve your writing by making it more active and vivid and interesting. The example Laini Taylor gave that I thought was really great when she tweeted about this, always got to give credit to Laini for kind of elucidating this concept for me, is she had written in her first draft that two characters kissed, and it wasn't until she was going back through and editing that she realized this is an important emotional moment and also just an important beat that readers love, that it was kind of not being done justice with a one-liner of, hey, they kissed. So she dramatized that moment instead to make it more emotionally satisfying for the reader. So think about examples like that, where you're just essentially glossing over the action of something. But be careful not to go overboard because you can't dramatize everything. But if you are finding that your ratio of narration to dramatization is off, anything where narration is more than 50% of your book, you might want to make some course corrections. And this is definitely one where I think it can instantly improve someone's writing and, storytelling. Tip number 4 for improving your writing is to pare down superfluous prose, or editing, which is my way of paring down my superfluous prose. This is a big one that I see, especially with, I hesitate to say novice writers, though I do see it in novice writers, but there are less novice writers who do this too. I think we all actually fall into this trap very often with drafting, especially if we're trying to get those word counts, or just days where we're feeling kind of awkward with writing, and we can't quite put our finger on the right way to say something or the best and most concise way to say something. And so our writing can end up very rambly. I see a lot that writers are basically, they're saying something in 8, 12, 15, 20 words, long ass, drawn out sentences, when by making some smart choices when it comes to verbs, action verbs, eliminating filtering and those sorts of things, you can basically pare down your sentences so that they're short and crisp and way more evocative and effective. So the big thing here often is verbs. I'll see people basically use a basic ass verb. It's usually a basic ass verb combined with a bunch of extra phrasing that kind of wraps around the verb to try to describe something, when all you have to do is basically use a better verb. You can cut all of that extra phrasing and create a vivid picture in the mind of the reader. So the tip here is, if you're not someone who knows a ton of great vivid verbs, brush up on that. You can Google it. There are all sorts of great resources, because I'm telling you, changing the verb in your sentence using very active, specific verbs can transform your writing. And then coupled with this very, very often is filtering. I know you've probably heard about filtering a lot. I have hesitated to make a whole video on filtering because sometimes I like filtering and I have a problem with filtering, but the point is, filter words are words that you use that literally filter the experience through the eyes of your main character, and it can create a lot of distance in the narrative and also lead to clunkier, more awkward sentences. So she felt, she saw, she thought, like those sorts of things, sometimes effective, but also very often clunky writing. So the combination of eliminating filter words where you can and thinking about more active, interesting verbs, you basically need to look at your sentences on a sentence by sentence level and think to yourself, could I say this better and more concisely? And very often the answer is yes, you could. And in reapproaching your sentences in the way that you're phrasing things, you can really firm up, crisp up, improve your writing. So an example that I wrote, as always, my examples aren't the best, but they still hopefully illustrate a point, because I never want to use like real examples of other people's writing because it seems cruel. So I always have to think of kind of bad examples on the fly. But I did come up with one, which is, she thought she saw a bird fly in a circle across the horizon. First of all, it's kind of a very long way to say something incredibly basic. I threw in some nice filtering there, and I used a very basic ass verb, which is fly, and then I had to use a little phrase to explain how the bird was flying. And if you rewrite that sentence just slightly, make a slight tweak, remove the filtering, change the verb, you can rewrite that to be, the bird arced across the horizon. Arc is a specific verb that basically means to not literally go in a circle, but it achieves the same idea, and it's a bird, so you assume they're flying. You don't actually have to say they're flying because it's a bird, they fly. So that's just like a real basic example. And think about it, now this sentence is more crisp and concise, and you can actually add add a more interesting description to it to make it a more impactful sentence overall. You could describe the horizon or more about the bird. I don't know, lots of options. Or you can just have a nice, clean, crisp sentence in your story, which is never a bad thing. Essentially, you should have interesting and complex sentences all over the place. I'm not arguing that all prose should be simple. I'm not a Hemingwayist. But by removing kind of extra phrasing, repetition, and weak verbs in your writing and having enough effective, short, concise sentences, you earn the space for the more complex prose that you might want to use. You don't want to bog your reader down with unnecessary long sentences. And there's nothing that annoys me more as a reader. When I'm reading something, I see this a lot actually in like blogging or journalism, where you read a long ass sentence and you're like, why did you have 3 lines to describe something basic as shit? Like, get to the goddamn point. And it demonstrates that someone is weaker at writing, because essentially writing is all about understanding what words mean when you put them in certain orders and using words effectively, verbs and adjectives and adverbs. Though don't go overboard with adjectives and adverbs either. That is another way to improve your writing. But again, I'm not on the anti-adverb train. I never have been. So reason why that's not in this list either. But hey, if you abuse adverbs, this is a bonus tip for this video. If you do abuse adverbs, reducing your use of adverbs and using stronger verbs is another great way to improve your writing. Really, the lesson of this one is stronger verbs, better verbs, more action verbs, and really watch your filtering. And the 5th way to improve your writing is, I'm a broken record. I've given this advice so many times in multiple videos, and I'm just never going to stop saying it. It is really almost the #1 piece of advice for improving your writing, but it is that like vague ass nebulous one where you might roll your eyes and go, how is this a concrete tip? But it is, you need to read. This is how pro writers very often improve their writing, because when you have a base level of skills, it's not about taking a class or watching a craft video. It is just about absorbing words that are strung together in beautiful sentences that mean things, and reading great books in the category that you want to write in, the genre that you love. And you see what good writing is. If you read enough good writing, you start to figure out what your weaknesses are. You see those authors to emulate. You start to understand the structure and the beats and the tropes of your genre, because improving your writing isn't just all the concrete prose vocabulary stuff. It is also storytelling craft, which is a slight deeper dive than this. It's so many things, and you get it all from reading often, widely, deeply. And I personally find, I know not every single writer is like this, but when I read enough in a specific genre or of a specific author, I absorb bits of their writing style. And it's not that I'm spitting out exactly their writing style, but it influences my writing style. So when I want to write fancy, I'll read more literary fiction. And it does kind of spark for me elevated prose in a lot of cases. I pay attention to when an author uses a word really beautifully, a vocabulary word that I hadn't thought of in a really long time that was just vivid and perfect. I look at descriptions, short descriptions that I'm really impressed by, and I'll jot them down. Be careful not to use them in whole cloth, because you don't want to copy other authors. Plagiarism is bad. But I do like to jot down really evocative phrasing as inspiration of what are they doing here, and analyzing it, and then thinking how I can do something similar to just effectively string words together. Reading is the #1 for improving your writing. And it's not just strictly about reading good books, though reading good books is going to make you a better writer. Honestly, reading books you don't love can make you a better writer as well, because if you learn to read like a writer and analyze why something isn't working for you, why you find something annoying, clunky phrasing, etc., you can do your own soul searching of your own writing. Like, I don't like it this here. Am I doing something similar? Do I fall into the same patterns? What can I learn from this thing I didn't like to improve my own writing? So that's it. 5 things you can do to improve your writing. Essentially, read a ton, do some soul searching, analyze other people's writing, dramatize more than you narrate, And watch those verbs and filtering and just basically any sentence that is long and meandering for no goddamn good reason. So yeah. Let me know down below in the comments, what are some of your favorite resources for improving your writing, anything you've done that has really upped your game, and give this video a thumbs up if you like it. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, guys, happy writing!